The amber glow of a neon sign flickered against the cracked asphalt of Highway 83, casting shadows that danced with the rhythm of dying bulbs. It was June 5, 1979, and the Cotton Ridge Diner sat like a lonely beacon in the vast expanse of West Texas prairie. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried catfish, while Patsy Cline's voice drifted from a corner jukebox that hadn't been updated since Kennedy was president. Deputy Walter Riggins, now 83, and wearing thick glasses that magnify his weathered eyes, holds a yellowed police report between trembling fingers. The paper crackles as he reads aloud. Subject: Jacob Earl Danner. Age 43. Occupation: farmer. Last seen leaving the Cotton Ridge Diner at 8:47 p.m., June 5, 1979. He pauses, looking up from the document. That was the beginning of the longest mystery this town ever saw. Marston, Texas, population 847, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Main Street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, bookended by Hutchinson's feed store on one end and the First Baptist Church on the other. The grain silo dominated the skyline like a concrete monument to simpler times, and on summer evenings, the sound of cicadas mixed with the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the relentless heat. Jacob Earl Danner had lived his entire life within a 20-mile radius of that grain silo. Born in the farmhouse his grandfather built in 1923, he inherited 240 acres of cotton and cattle land when his father passed in 1967. Neighbors described him as a man of few words, but strong convictions, the type who measured his worth in rainfall and crop yields, who shook hands on deals worth thousands of dollars and never needed a contract. Jacob was old school, recalls Betty Morrison, who worked the evening shift at the Cotton Ridge Diner for nearly 30 years. Her voice carries the weight of decades spent serving coffee and collecting stories. He'd come in every Tuesday and Friday, same booth by the window, same order: chicken fried steak, black coffee, and a slice of peach pie, if we had it fresh. She gestures toward a corner booth where the red vinyl still bears the permanent impression of countless conversations. He wasn't much for talking, but when he did speak, people listened. The summer of 1979 had been particularly harsh. The drought stretched into its 3rd month, leaving the cotton fields brittle and brown. Local farmers gathered at the diner each morning, their conversations dominated by talk of failing crops and mounting debts. The farmer's almanac had promised rain, but the sky remained stubbornly clear, stretched tight as canvas across the endless horizon. For Jacob, the drought meant more than financial strain. His cattle were losing weight, his well was running low, and the bank in nearby Sweetwater had been making increasingly frequent calls about his loan payment. But those who knew him best said he seemed determined to weather the storm, as his family had done for generations before him. That boy was stubborn as a mule, says Ernest Whitaker, Jacob's closest neighbor and childhood friend. At 79, Ernest still works his own land, though his hands now shake when he lights his morning cigarette. I'd offered to help him with the hay that spring, but Jacob, he always wanted to do things his own way, said it was his land, his responsibility. The evening of June 5th started like any other. Jacob had spent the day repairing fence posts on the southern boundary of his property, work that left his denim shirt soaked with sweat and his hands raw from handling barbed wire. Around 6 o'clock, he'd driven his green 1974 Chevrolet pickup into Towner, routine trip to pick up feed, supplements, and grab dinner at the diner. Martha Collins, who lived in the yellow house across from the diner, remembers seeing Jacob's truck in the parking lot when she went to collect her mail. The sun was just starting to set, she recalls, her voice barely above a whisper. I waved at him through the window, and he tipped his hat like he always did. Polite boy, raised right by his mama. Inside the diner, Jacob sat in his usual booth, methodically cutting his chicken fried steak, while listening to the conversations around him. The talk that evening centered on Royce Halbrook, a newcomer who'd purchased the Davidson farm 6 months earlier. Royce had big plans, talk of expanding operations, maybe even selling to one of those corporate agricultural companies moving into the area. There was tension there, no denying it, admits Frank Hutchinson, whose feed store served as the unofficial gathering place for local gossip. Royce had made an offer on Jacob's land, said he wanted to consolidate the properties. Jacob turned him down flat, told him the land wasn't for sale at any price. The conversation at the diner that evening grew heated when Royce himself walked in around 8:30. Witnesses remember the sudden quiet that fell over the room, the way conversations died mid-sentence. Royce, a tall man with slicked-back hair and city clothes that never quite fit in among the work shirts and worn denim of the local farmers, ordered coffee to go and left within minutes. Jacob finished his meal in silence, paid Betty Morrison with exact change as always, and walked out into the humid Texas evening. It was 8:47 p.m., according to the receipt Betty kept, a detail that would later prove crucial to the investigation. He looked tired, Betty remembers, her eyes distant with the weight of memory, more tired than usual, but he said goodnight, like always, told me to tell my husband hello. That was the last thing Jacob Earl Danner ever said to me. Several witnesses saw Jacob's pickup leave the diner parking lot, but their accounts began to diverge almost immediately. Sarah Jenkins, who was walking her dog along Main Street, swore she saw the green Chevrolet heading east toward Jacob's farm, but Tommy Rodriguez, who was closing up his gas station 3 blocks away, insisted the truck turned west toward the Old Mill Road. That's where the confusion started, explains Deputy Riggins, his finger tracing the route on a faded map of Marston County. 2 reliable witnesses, 2 different directions. In a case like this, those early details matter more than you might think. The temperature that night dropped to a comfortable 78 degrees, unusual for early June. A light breeze carried the scent of mesquite and sage across the prairie, and the moon, 3 days past full, cast silver shadows across the dirt roads that connected one farm to another. It was the kind of night when sounds carried for miles, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of windmills turning in the wind, the occasional bark of a farm dog. By midnight, when Jacob hadn't returned home, no one was particularly concerned. He was a grown man, after all, and it wasn't unusual for him to stay late at the feed store or help a neighbor with some emergency. His cattle were secure, his pickup was reliable, and Jacob Danner had never been the type to worry others with his whereabouts. But as dawn broke over the endless Texas horizon on June 6th, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jacob's absence became impossible to ignore. His cattle were bellowing for their morning feed, his pickup was nowhere to be seen, and for the first time in 23 years, Jacob Earl Danner had missed his standing appointment to help his neighbor Ernest move hay bales. That's when I knew something was wrong, Ernest recalls, his voice heavy with the weight of decades-old worry. Jacob might have been stubborn, but he was reliable as sunrise. If he said he'd be there by 7 a.m. Ernest had called the sheriff's office. By 8 a.m., Deputy Riggins was driving the county roads, looking for any sign of Jacob's green Chevrolet. The search would continue for weeks, but already, in those first few hours, the seeds of mystery had been planted. The Cotton Ridge Diner still stands today, though the neon sign flickers more often now, and the jukebox plays different songs. Betty Morrison retired 15 years ago, but she still drives past the diner every Tuesday and Friday, still thinks about the man who ordered chicken fried steak and vanished into the Texas night. Some stories, she says, staring across the prairie where the heat still rises in shimmering waves, just don't have endings. They just keep going, like those old windmills out there, turning and never wearing out. The morning sun climbed higher over Marston County as Sheriff Ray Hutchinson organized the first official search for Jacob Earl Danner. It was June 7, 1979, 36 hours since anyone had seen the missing farmer, and the reality of his disappearance was beginning to settle over the small community like dust after a windstorm. We started with the assumption that Jacob had car trouble, Sheriff Hutchinson explains, his voice weathered by 40 years of law enforcement in rural Texas. Now retired and living in a mobile home on the outskirts of town, he keeps the original case files in a metal box beside his kitchen table. In those days, breakdowns were common. We figured we'd find him and his truck on some back road, maybe with a blown tire or engine trouble. The search began systematically. Deputy Riggins took the eastern routes toward Jacob's farm, while Sheriff Hutchinson covered the western roads leading to the old mill and the creek bottoms. Local volunteers, farmers, store owners, even Royce Halbrook himself, spread out across the county's network of dirt roads and cattle paths. The whole town turned out, remembers Grace Patterson, who organized coffee and sandwiches for the search teams from her position at the Methodist Church. Even people who barely knew Jacob came to help. That's how small towns work when one of us is missing. We all feel it. By noon on the second day, they had covered over 200 square miles of prairie, ranch land, and creek beds. The temperature reached 94 degrees, and the search teams began to show signs of heat exhaustion. Still no sign of Jacob, or his green Chevrolet pickup. It was Tommy Rodriguez who first suggested checking Old Mill Creek, a seasonal waterway that meandered through the countryside about 12 miles southwest of town. Jacob used to fish there sometimes, Tommy told the sheriff. Might have gone out there to think, clear his head after all that business with Halbrook. The creek had been nearly dry for months, reduced to scattered pools of stagnant water and cracked mudflats. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves already showing the stress of the ongoing drought. It was a peaceful place, the kind of spot where a man might go to escape the pressures of failing crops and mounting debts. They found Jacob's truck at 3:47 p.m. on June 8th. The green Chevrolet sat abandoned on a dirt road that paralleled the creek, about 200 yards from the water's edge. Both doors were open, as if Jacob had exited quickly or been interrupted in the middle of something. The keys hung from the ignition, and when Deputy Riggins turned them, the engines started immediately. It was like he'd just stepped away for a minute, Riggins recalls, his hands shaking slightly as he lights another cigarette. Radio was still tuned to KBST, the country station out of Big Spring. Tank was half full. Nothing looked disturbed inside the cab, but there were troubling details. Jacob's work gloves lay scattered in the dirt beside the driver's door, one near the front tire, the other about 10 feet away, near a clump of prickly pear cactus. A crushed pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, Jacob's preferred brand, was found partially buried in the sandy soil. Most unsettling of all, Jacob's wallet was still in the truck, containing $63 in cash and his driver's license. People don't just walk away from their wallets, Sheriff Hutchinson noted in his report, and Jacob wasn't the type to abandon his truck, especially with the keys in it. Something happened here, but what exactly, we couldn't determine. The area around the creek was searched thoroughly. Bloodhounds were brought in from Midland, their handlers directing them in wide circles around the abandoned pickup. The dogs picked up Jacob's scent, leading from the truck toward the creek. But the trail went cold at the water's edge, where the dried mud showed no clear footprints. The dogs seemed confused, remembers Carl Morrison, one of the handlers. They'd followed the scent to the creek bank, then circled back, whining, like the trail just stopped. Days turned into weeks. The initial urgency of the search gave way to a more methodical investigation. Sheriff Hutchinson interviewed everyone who had seen Jacob in the days before his disappearance. The stories were consistent. Jacob had been quiet, perhaps more withdrawn than usual, but showed no signs of planning to leave town. He'd ordered seed for the fall planting just 3 days before he disappeared, recalls Frank Hutchinson from the feed store. Paid cash, like always. Man doesn't order winter seed if he's planning to skip town. The investigation inevitably focused on the growing tension between Jacob and Royce Halbrook. Several witnesses confirmed that the two men had argued publicly about the land sale, with Jacob firmly refusing Royce's increasingly generous offers. Royce, for his part, insisted he had driven straight home after leaving the diner that Tuesday night. "I barely knew the man," Royce told investigators, his statement preserved in the case files. "I made him a fair offer for his land. He turned it down, and that was the end of it. I certainly had no reason to wish him harm, but doubt lingered in the community." Royce was an outsider, a man with money and ambition who didn't quite fit the rhythm of rural life. His explanations seemed too neat, his alibis too convenient. When whispers began circulating that he had been seen near Old Mill Creek the night Jacob disappeared, Sheriff Hutchinson brought him in for formal questioning. Royce had an answer for everything. Deputy Riggins remembers, said he'd been home all evening watching television, had the TV guide to prove what shows were on. But something about his story felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Royce maintained his innocence throughout, even when confronted with conflicting witness statements. One farmer claimed to have seen a vehicle matching Royce's blue Ford near the creek road that night, but the identification was made from a distance and couldn't be confirmed. Summer faded into fall, and the Jacob Danner case began to consume the entire town. Conversations at the Cotton Ridge Diner revolved around theories and speculation. Some believed Royce had killed Jacob over the land dispute. Others suspected Jacob's younger brother, Henry, who had always resented Jacob's inheritance of the family farm. Henry left town about 3 weeks after Jacob disappeared, notes Grace Patterson, her voice heavy with implication. Packed up his trailer and moved to Oklahoma without so much as a goodbye. People thought that was suspicious. The departure of Henry Danner added another layer of complexity to an already confusing case. Henry had been working as a mechanic in town, living in a small trailer behind Hutchinson's garage. He'd always been the black sheep of the family, quick to anger, slow to forgive, with a reputation for drinking too much on Saturday nights. Henry and Jacob had their differences, admits Ernest Whitaker, choosing his words carefully. Brothers don't always see eye to eye, especially when it comes to land and money. But I never thought Henry would hurt Jacob. They were family. Sheriff Hutchinson questioned Henry extensively before his departure, but found no evidence linking him to his brother's disappearance. Henry claimed he was leaving town because staying brought back too many painful memories of Jacob. He provided investigators with an address in Tulsa and promised to remain available for questioning. Henry was grieving. Sheriff Hutchinson concluded, "Sometimes grief makes people do things that look suspicious when they're really just trying to escape the pain." As 1979 turned into 1980, the active search for Jacob Danner gradually wound down. The case remained open, but without new leads or evidence, there was little for investigators to pursue. The community began the slow process of accepting that Jacob might never return. "After a while, you have to get on with living," explains Betty Morrison, who continued working at the diner through the years that followed. But it changes a place. Having someone just vanish like that makes you look at your neighbors differently. Wonder what you really know about anybody. The Cotton Ridge Diner became an unofficial monument to Jacob's memory. His corner booth remained empty for months, as if customers instinctively avoided the space where he had eaten his last meal. Betty kept his favorite coffee cup behind the counter, a small blue ceramic mug with a chip on the handle that Jacob had always requested. Years passed. The drought finally broke in the spring of 1981, bringing the kind of rains that Jacob had prayed for during those last desperate months. His abandoned farmhouse slowly deteriorated, windows broken by vandals or storms, the front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The land was eventually sold to pay off debts, purchased by ironically Royce Halbrook, who consolidated it with his existing holding. Royce got what he wanted in the end, observes Frank Hutchinson with obvious bitterness. Maybe not the way he planned, but he got the land. That always bothered people. The investigation officially went cold in 1983, though Sheriff Hutchinson continued to follow up on occasional tips and reported sighting. Jacob's truck was eventually released from evidence and sold at auction. The proceeds went to pay outstanding debts on the farm. Every few months, someone would call and say they'd seen a man who looked like Jacob in Dallas or Houston or San Antonio. Deputy Riggins recalls, "We'd check out the leads, but they never panned out. People see what they want to see, especially when they're hoping for a happy ending." The silence that settled over Marston in the years following Jacob's disappearance was different from the comfortable quiet of a small town. It was the silence of unanswered questions, of theories spoken in whispers, of a community divided by suspicion and uncertainty. "We all learned to live with not knowing," says Grace Patterson, now in her 80s and still active in the Methodist Church. "But it changed us, made us more careful, more suspicious. We locked our doors at night, something we'd never done before." The passage of time brought new families to Marston, people who had never known Jacob Danner and viewed his disappearance as ancient history. But for those who had lived through it, the mystery remained as fresh as the day his truck was found beside Old Mill Creek. "Time doesn't heal everything," reflects Betty Morrison, standing in the parking lot where Jacob's green Chevrolet once sat. "Some wounds just learn to live with the air." By 1990, 11 years after Jacob's disappearance, most of the original investigators had retired or moved away. The case files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, referenced occasionally when new deputies needed examples of unsolved cases. The story became local legend, passed down to newcomers as a cautionary tale about the dangers of small-town secrets. But the questions remained, hanging over Marston County like heat shimmer on summer pavement. What happened to Jacob Earl Danner? Why was his truck found at Old Mill Creek? And why, after all these years, did the truth seem as elusive as rain in a drought? 25 years had passed since Jacob Earl Danner vanished into the Texas night. The summer of 2004 brought record-breaking heat to Marston County, with temperatures soaring past 100 degrees for 14 consecutive days. The drought was back with a vengeance, worse than the one that had plagued Jacob's final summer, turning the landscape into a patchwork of brown earth and withered vegetation. Old Mill Creek, the site where Jacob's truck had been found all those years ago, was completely dry for the first time in living memory. What had once been a meandering waterway was now nothing more than a series of cracked depressions in the earth, exposing decades of accumulated sediment and debris. It was this drought that brought the construction crew to the creek bed on August 15, 2004. The Texas Department of Transportation was replacing a deteriorating culvert that ran beneath Farm Road 1208, and the dry conditions provided an opportunity to complete the work without dealing with flowing water. Danny Vasquez had been operating heavy machinery for nearly 30 years, but he'd never worked a job quite like this one. The creek bed was like concrete. He remembers wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana that's seen better days. We had to use jackhammers just to break through the top layer. Felt like we were mining instead of doing road work. The crew had been working since dawn, fighting against the brutal heat and the unforgiving hard-pan soil. By mid-afternoon, they had excavated a trench approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, exposing layers of sediment that told the story of decades of flood and drought cycles. It was Danny's partner, Miguel Santos, who first noticed something unusual glinting in the afternoon sun. "I thought it was just a piece of scrap metal at first," Miguel recalls, his voice soft with the weight of memory. "But when I bent down to look closer, I could see it was shaped like something specific, something deliberate." What Miguel had found, buried 18 inches deep in the compacted creek bed sediment, was a belt buckle. Not just any belt buckle, but one made of sterling silver, with an intricate engraving that was still clearly visible despite years underground. The design featured a longhorn steer above the letters JED in flowing script. "I've seen enough Western movies to know a cowboy belt buckle when I see one," Miguel says with a nervous laugh. "But those initials, that's what made me call the supervisor." Danny immediately stopped the excavation and called his foreman, who in turn contacted the sheriff's office. Within 2 hours, the construction site was transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape marking the boundaries where heavy machinery had been just hours before. Sheriff Patricia Williams had only been in office for 6 months, having won election as the county's first female sheriff on a platform of modernizing law enforcement and revisiting cold cases. She was 34 years old, a former Texas Ranger with a reputation for thoroughness and a stubborn refusal to accept easy answers. "When I got the call about the belt buckle, I knew exactly what case they were talking about," Sheriff Williams explains, sitting in her office where Jacob Danner's case file occupies a prominent place on her desk. The JED initials, the location. It couldn't be a coincidence. Sheriff Williams immediately contacted Deputy Walter Riggins, now retired, but still living in town. At 79, Riggins had lost some of his hearing and walked with a cane, but his memory of the Danner case remained sharp as a tack. Walt took one look at that belt buckle and started crying. Sheriff Williams remembers, he said, "Jacob wore it every day, had won it at a rodeo in Sweetwater back in 1976. His brother, Henry, had given him grief about being too old for rodeo, but Jacob was proud of that buckle." The discovery sent shockwaves through Marston. News of the find spread quickly through the small community, reviving memories and reopening wounds that many had assumed were permanently healed. The Cotton Ridge Diner buzzed with conversation as longtime residents shared their memories of Jacob and speculated about what the buckle might mean. "It was like 1979 all over again," recalls Betty Morrison, who still lived in town, though she'd retired from the diner years earlier. "Suddenly, everyone was talking about Jacob again, wondering if we'd finally get some answers." The construction site became a full archaeological excavation. Sheriff Williams brought in specialists from Texas Tech University, who carefully sifted through cubic yards of creek bed sediment, looking for any other artifacts that might be connected to Jacob's disappearance. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist leading the university team, approached the excavation with scientific precision. "Creek beds are excellent preservers of artifacts," she explains, reviewing her field notes from the dig. "The constant moisture, followed by the compaction of sediment, can preserve organic materials for decades." The team worked in carefully measured grid squares, photographing and cataloging every item they uncovered. Besides the belt buckle, they found the usual detritus of rural life: rusted cans, broken bottles, a child's toy truck from the 1960s, fragments of farm equipment. But on the third day of excavation, they made another significant discovery. Buried 3 feet from where the belt buckle was found, in what would have been the deeper part of the creek channel, they uncovered a leather work boot, size 11. the same size Jacob had worn, according to his brother Henry's testimony from 1979. The boot was in remarkably good condition, preserved by the creek bed's unique conditions. Finding that boot changed everything, Dr. Chen recalls. A belt buckle could have been lost or discarded, but a belt buckle and a boot, found in proximity to each other, in the exact location where the missing person's vehicle was abandoned. That suggests something much more significant happened here. The boot contained no foot bones, disappointing investigators who had hoped for more definitive evidence. But soil analysis revealed traces of human DNA. Though the degraded condition made individual identification impossible with the technology available in 2004, news of the discoveries reached Jacob's surviving family members. Henry Danner, now 58, and living in Tulsa, drove to Texas for the first time since leaving in 1979. His reunion with the investigation was emotional and complicated. Henry looked like he'd aged 20 years for every 10 that had passed, observes Deputy Riggins. The guilt had been eating at him all those years. You could see it in his eyes. Henry's return to Marston stirred up old suspicions. Some residents remembered his abrupt departure after Jacob's disappearance, and wondered if he knew more than he'd ever admitted. But Sheriff Williams approached the situation with fresh eyes, unclouded by decades of small-town rumors. I interviewed Henry for 8 hours over 2 days. Sheriff Williams explains. He was cooperative, even volunteered for a polygraph test. But more importantly, he provided information that helped us understand Jacob's state of mind in those final weeks. According to Henry, Jacob had been under more pressure than anyone realized. The land dispute with Royce Halbrook was just the surface of deeper financial troubles. Jacob had borrowed heavily against future crops that the drought had destroyed. He was facing bankruptcy and the loss of the family land that had been in the Danner name for over 50 years. Jacob was proud, maybe too proud. Henry told investigators he'd rather die than lose that farm. It was all he had, all he was. But Henry also revealed something that hadn't come out in the original investigation. 3 days before his disappearance, Jacob had received a phone call that visibly upset him. Henry was visiting the farm when the call came in, and though he could only hear Jacob's side of the conversation, it was clearly contentious. Jacob kept saying, "That's not what we agreed, and you can't do this to me," Henry recalled. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. I asked him what was wrong, but he just said it was business and walked away. Henry had assumed the call was from the bank, or perhaps from Royce Halbrook, pressuring him about the land sale. But now, 25 years later, he wondered if there had been something more sinister involved. The excavation continued for 2 weeks, but no additional significant artifacts were discovered. The belt buckle and boot were sent to the FBI lab in Quantico for detailed analysis, while Sheriff Williams began the process of re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Many of the key players were dead or had moved away. Royce Halbrook had died of a heart attack in 1997, taking whatever secrets he might have harbored to the grave. Sheriff Ray Hutchinson had passed away in 2001. Frank Hutchinson from the feed store was in a nursing home in Abilene, his memory failing due to Alzheimer's disease. But some witnesses remained, and their stories had evolved over the decade. Betty Morrison now admitted that she'd seen Royce Halbrook talking intensely with someone in the diner parking lot the night Jacob disappeared, but she'd been afraid to mention it at the time because she wasn't certain of what she'd seen. It was getting dark, and I was tired, Betty explains, her voice heavy with years of regret. But now, looking back, I'm pretty sure Royce was arguing with someone in a pickup truck. I couldn't see who it was, but the truck looked like Jacob. This revelation cast the timeline of Jacob's disappearance in an entirely new light. If Betty's memory was accurate, it meant Jacob and Royce had met after Jacob left the diner, not before. It suggested a planned meeting rather than a chance encounter. Tommy Rodriguez, the gas station owner who had insisted he'd seen Jacob's truck heading west that night, also came forward with additional information. I've been thinking about that night for 25 years, Tommy says, his voice barely above a whisper. I never told anybody this because I wasn't sure it mattered. But about an hour after I saw Jacob's truck, I saw Royce's blue Ford driving back toward town. He was driving fast, like he was in a hurry. The new testimonies painted a picture of a meeting between Jacob and Royce at Old Mill Creek, a confrontation that might have escalated beyond what either man had intended. But without Royce alive to confirm or deny the allegations, the theories remained just that theory. Dr. Chen's analysis of the belt buckle revealed microscopic traces of what appeared to be blood, though DNA testing was inconclusive due to the age and degradation of the sample. The boot showed signs of having been submerged in water for an extended period before being buried in the creek bed sediment. The evidence suggests that these items were originally deposited when the creek was flowing, Dr. Chen reported. They would have been swept downstream from their original location and gradually buried as sediment accumulated over the years. This finding was significant because it meant the belt buckle and boot might not have been lost at the exact spot where Jacob's truck was found. They could have originated from anywhere upstream, including areas that hadn't been searched in the original investigation. Sheriff Williams ordered a comprehensive search of the creek bed, extending 5 miles upstream from the excavation site. Using ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, teams systematically covered every section of the dried waterway. But after 3 weeks of intensive searching, no additional evidence was discovered. The investigation reached another dead end, but the discovery of Jacob's belongings had fundamentally changed the case. What had once been a missing person investigation was now clearly a homicide, even without a body. Someone had killed Jacob Earl Danner and disposed of evidence in Old Mill Creek. Finding that belt buckle proved Jacob didn't just walk away. Sheriff Williams states with conviction, he was murdered, and whoever did it thought the creek would wash away the evidence forever. They almost got away with it too. As autumn arrived in 2004, the renewed investigation began to wind down. The construction crew completed their culvert replacement, and the site was returned to its natural state. But the discovery had reopened old wounds in Marston, dividing the community once again between those who believed Royce Halbrook had killed Jacob and those who suspected someone else entirely. The truth, like Jacob himself, remained buried somewhere in the vast expanse of West Texas prairie, waiting for time and circumstance to finally bring it to light. The winter of 2004 settled over Marston County with an unusual stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The discovery of Jacob's belt buckle had stirred up decades-old memories, but as Christmas approached, the renewed investigation seemed to be losing momentum once again. Sheriff Patricia Williams found herself staring at the same evidence that had confounded investigators for 25 years, wondering if the truth would ever surface. Then, on a cold February morning in 2005, everything changed. Dolores Halbrook was cleaning out her late husband's workshop when she found the box. Royce had been dead for 8 years, and she had finally decided to sort through the accumulated debris of 40 years of marriage. The workshop, a converted barn behind their farmhouse, had always been Royce's private domain, a place where he retreated to tinker with machinery and escape the pressures of running an increasingly successful agricultural operation. I'd avoided going through his things for so long, Dolores explains, her voice trembling with emotion even now, nearly 2 decades later. Royce was a private man, and that workshop was his sanctuary. I suppose I felt like I was violating something sacred by being there. The box was hidden behind a stack of old Farm Bureau magazine, covered with a tarp and pushed into the darkest corner of the workshop. It was an ordinary cardboard box, the kind used for storing Christmas decorations, but its contents would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Marston for a generation. Inside, Dolores found a collection of documents that chronicled a side of her husband she had never known. Bank statements showing large cash withdrawals, receipts for equipment purchases that didn't match anything on their farm, and most disturbing of all, a series of photographs and documents that revealed Royce's involvement in an illegal cattle operation. I couldn't understand what I was looking at first, Dolores recalls, her hands shaking as she remembers that February morning. Royce always said his money came from smart investments and hard work. I never questioned it because we were comfortable, and he seemed to know what he was doing. The documents painted a picture of systematic cattle rustling that had been going on for years. Royce had been stealing cattle from neighboring ranches, altering their brands, and selling them through a network of corrupt dealers in Oklahoma and New Mexico. The operation was sophisticated, involving forged health certificates, fraudulent transportation permits, and buyers who asked no questions about the origins of the livestock. But it was the final item in the box that connected Royce's criminal activities to Jacob Danner's disappearance. Wrapped in an oil-stained cloth was a small tape recorder, the kind used for dictating business correspondence. The tape inside was labeled with a single date, June 5, 1979. Dolores stared at the tape recorder for nearly an hour before finding the courage to press play. What she heard would haunt her for the rest of her life. The recording was of poor quality, obviously made in secret, but the voices were clear enough to understand. Jacob Danner was confronting Royce about the missing cattle, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "You've been stealing from me for months." Jacob's voice crackled through the old speaker. "I counted my herd 3 times. Royce, I'm missing 14 head, and I know you took them." Royce's response was calm, almost condescending. "You can't prove anything, Jacob. Cattle wander off all the time. Maybe you just can't count as good as you think you can." The conversation escalated quickly. Jacob accused Royce of being a thief and threatened to report him to the sheriff. Royce laughed, telling Jacob that no one would believe the word of a failing farmer over a successful businessman like himself. "You're finished in this county, Jacob." Royce's voice turned menacing. "Your farm is going under anyway. Why don't you just take my offer for the land and walk away? Save yourself some dignity." Jacob's response was defiant. "I'll see you in hell before I sell you my family's land, and I'm going to the sheriff tomorrow morning. People deserve to know what kind of man you really are." The recording ended abruptly, but its implications were devastating. Jacob had discovered Royce's cattle rustling operation and threatened to expose him. The meeting at Old Mill Creek that night hadn't been about a land deal, it had been Jacob's final confrontation with the man who had been systematically robbing him. Dolores sat in the cold workshop for hours, listening to the tape over and over, trying to reconcile the man she had married with the voice on the recording. When she finally worked up the courage to call Sheriff William, her world collapsed completely. Mrs. Halbrook was in shock. Sheriff Williams remembers, she kept saying she never knew that Royce had hidden this side of his life from her completely. I believed her. Living with someone doesn't mean you know everything about them, especially if they're determined to keep secrets. The tape recording provided the missing piece of the puzzle, but it also raised new questions. The recording ended with Jacob threatening to go to the sheriff. But what happened after that? How did the confrontation escalate to murder? And where was Jacob's body? Sheriff Williams assembled a team of investigators to examine every aspect of Royce's criminal operation. Bank records showed that his cattle rustling had been going on for at least 5 years before Jacob's disappearance, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits. The scope of the operation was staggering. Royce had been stealing cattle from ranches across 3 counties, using his legitimate agricultural business as cover for the criminal enterprise. Royce was smart, admits FBI agent Rebecca Martinez, who was brought in to investigate the interstate aspects of the cattle rustling. He never got too greedy, never took enough cattle from any one ranch to raise immediate suspicions. He spread the thefts out over time and distance, making it almost impossible to detect the pattern. But Jacob Danner had detected the pattern. As a careful rancher who knew his cattle individually, Jacob had noticed the disappearances that other, larger operators might have missed. His meticulous record-keeping and intimate knowledge of his herd had made him the one person who could expose Royce's entire operation. The investigation team used the information from Dolores's discovery to re-interview witnesses from the original case. Armed with knowledge of the cattle rustling motive, they were able to make sense of previously confusing testimony. Ernest Whitaker, Jacob's neighbor and childhood friend, now remembered seeing unfamiliar cattle trucks on rural roads at odd hours during the months before Jacob's disappearance. "I thought it was strange at the time," Ernest admits. But Royce said he was expanding his operation, buying cattle from ranchers in other counties. "I didn't think to question it." Maria Santos, who worked as a part-time bookkeeper for several local ranchers, recalled discrepancies in cattle counts that she had noticed but hadn't understood at the time. "Some of the ranchers would ask me to reconcile their numbers, saying they seemed to be missing cattle," Maria explains. "But they always assumed the animals had just wandered off or been miscounted." The pattern became clear. Royce had been systematically stealing cattle from ranchers across the region, using his knowledge of their operations and his reputation in the community to avoid suspicion. Jacob's discovery threatened to expose not just the thefts, but the entire network of corrupt dealers and fraudulent documentation that made the operation possible. But the tape recording still didn't explain exactly how Jacob had died, or what had happened to his body. Sheriff Williams knew that, without physical evidence or additional witnesses, building a murder case against a dead man would be nearly impossible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carlos Mendoza had been working as a ranch hand for various operations in the area during the late 1970s. He was undocumented at the time, and had avoided contact with law enforcement during the original investigation. But in 2005, as a naturalized citizen with children and grandchildren in the community, he finally felt safe enough to come forward with his story. "I saw something that night," Carlos tells investigators, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "June 5, 1979. I was checking cattle for the Morrison Ranch out near Old Mill Creek. I heard voices, arguing, coming from the creek bottom. Carlos had hidden in a stand of mesquite trees, afraid that he might be discovered by immigration authorities. From his concealed position, he had witnessed the final confrontation between Jacob Danner and Royce Halbrook. Jacob was very angry," Carlos recalls, his voice barely above a whisper. He was shouting about his cattle, calling Royce a thief. Royce was trying to calm him down, but Jacob wouldn't listen. According to Carlos, the argument escalated when Jacob lunged at Royce, trying to grab what appeared to be documents from his hands. The two men struggled, and Jacob slipped on the muddy creek bank, striking his head on a large limestone rock. "It happened so fast," Carlos says, tears forming in his eyes. One moment they were fighting. The next moment, Jacob was lying very still. Royce kept saying, "Jacob, wake up. Come on, wake up." But Jacob didn't move. Carlos watched in horror as Royce checked Jacob for signs of life, then began to panic when he realized Jacob was dead. Royce spent nearly an hour at the creek, apparently trying to decide what to do with the body. Finally, he loaded Jacob into the back of his own truck and drove away, leaving Jacob's pickup at the scene to make it look like he had abandoned it there. "I was scared," Carlos admits. "I was in the country illegally, and I had just witnessed a man die. I thought if I came forward, I would be deported and maybe blamed for what happened. So I said nothing." Carlos's testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Jacob's death had been accidental, the result of a struggle that escalated beyond what either man had intended. But Royce's decision to conceal the death and dispose of the body had transformed an accident into a murder. The question of what happened to Jacob's body remained unanswered. Carlos had seen Royce drive away with it, but he didn't know where Royce had taken it. Given the vastness of West Texas and the number of abandoned oil wells, stock tanks, and remote canyons in the area, the body might never be found. Royce had days to dispose of the body before anyone started looking for Jacob. Sheriff Williams explains. He knew the country, had access to heavy equipment, and understood how to make something disappear permanently. Without Carlos coming forward, we never would have known what really happened. The revelation brought a mixture of relief and frustration to Jacob's surviving family and friends. They finally knew how he had died, but the location of his remains was still a mystery. Henry Danner, who had carried guilt about his brother's disappearance for 25 years, found some peace in learning that Jacob's death had been accidental. Jacob wasn't murdered in cold blood, Henry tells investigators, his voice heavy with emotion. He died trying to protect what was his, standing up to a thief. "That sounds like the brother I knew." Dolores Halbrook faced her own reckoning with the truth about her late husband. The man she had lived with for 30 years had been leading a double life, stealing from his neighbors and covering up a man's death. The comfortable life she had enjoyed was built on the profits from crime. "I keep asking myself how I could have been so blind," Dolores says, standing in the doorway of the workshop where she made her terrible discovery. "Were there signs I missed? Things I should have questioned? I'll never know." In a gesture that surprised the entire community, Dolores donated a significant portion of Royce's estate to establish a scholarship fund in Jacob's name at the local high school. She also worked with authorities to identify and compensate the ranchers who had been victims of her husband's cattle rustling operation. "I can't bring Jacob back," Dolores explains, "but I can try to make things right for the people my husband hurt. It's the least I can do." The case of Jacob Earl Danner was officially closed in September 2005, nearly 26 years after his disappearance. The resolution brought closure to some and raised new questions for others. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. In the end, it wasn't about land or money, reflects Sheriff Williams. It was about honor and pride, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. Jacob died because he couldn't stand by and watch someone steal from him. Royce lived with that secret for 18 years, until it killed him too. The Cotton Ridge Diner still serves coffee and chicken fried steak to travelers on Highway 83. Jacob's corner booth is no longer kept empty, but a small plaque on the wall honors his memory and the memory of all those who have vanished without a trace. Betty Morrison, now in her 80s, still stops by occasionally to have coffee and remember the quiet farmer who disappeared into the Texas night. The truth didn't bring Jacob back, Betty observes, stirring cream into her coffee with a spoon that trembles slightly in her aged hands. But at least now we know he didn't abandon us. He was just doing what he thought was right, standing up for what was his. The vast expanse of West Texas prairie stretches endlessly beyond the diner windows, holding countless secrets beneath its surface. Somewhere out there, Jacob Earl Danner finally rests, his long journey home complete in ways that transcend the physical world. The autumn wind carries a different sound across Marston County now, whistling through the same cottonwood trees that witnessed Jacob Earl Danner's final confrontation 27 years ago. Old Mill Creek flows again, fed by recent rains that have broken another cycle of drought. The water runs clear over the limestone rocks where Jacob fell, washing away the last physical traces of that terrible night in 1979. Standing on the bridge that spans the creek, Sheriff Patricia Williams watches the current flow toward the distant horizon. She has been sheriff for 3 years now, long enough to understand that some cases never truly close. Even when the files are marked solved and stored in the basement of the courthouse, people think finding the truth means everything goes back to normal, Williams reflects, her voice carrying the weight of experience. But some truths change a community forever. They become part of who you are, part of your story. The Jacob Danner case officially closed in September 2005, but its effects continue to ripple through Marston like stones thrown into still water. The revelation of Royce Halbrook's cattle rustling operation led to a broader investigation that uncovered similar crimes across 3 states. Dozens of ranchers discovered they had been victims of systematic theft, their losses hidden by the vast distances and independent nature of rural life. Royce was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, explains FBI agent Rebecca Martinez, who spent 2 years unraveling the interstate cattle rustling network. We found evidence of organized operations stretching from Texas to Colorado, involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen livestock. Jacob's discovery opened a door we didn't even know existed. The financial impact was significant, but the emotional cost was higher. Ranchers who had trusted their neighbors for generations now questioned every transaction, every handshake deal, every friendly conversation at the feed store. The informal networks of cooperation that had sustained rural communities for decades were fractured by suspicion and doubt. It changed how we do business, admits Tom Patterson, who inherited his family's ranch in 1995. My grandfather never locked a gate or counted cattle twice. Now we brand everything, photograph everything, document everything. The trust is gone. The Cotton Ridge Diner serves as an unofficial museum of the case now. Betty Morrison donated her collection of newspaper clippings and photographs to the restaurant, creating a memorial wall that draws visitors from across the state. Tourists stop to read about the farmer who vanished and the 26-year search for truth, adding their own theories to the guest book that sits beside the coffee pot. People are fascinated by mysteries, observes Linda Chen, Betty's niece who now manages the diner. They want to understand how something like this could happen, how a man could just disappear in a place where everyone knows everyone. It makes them think about their own communities, their own secrets. The memorial wall includes a photograph of Jacob taken at the 1976 rodeo, where he won the belt buckle that would eventually help solve his case. In the picture, Jacob is younger, smiling beneath the brim of his cowboy hat, holding his prize with obvious pride. It's the image most people remember now, rather than the missing person posters that had haunted the community for decades. Henry Danner returned to Texas permanently in 2006, purchasing a small house on the outskirts of Marston. At 60, he walks with a limp from an oil field accident, but his eyes hold a peace that had been absent during his years of exile in Oklahoma. I came back because I needed to be close to Jacob, Henry explains, sitting on his front porch as the sun sets over the prairie. For 27 years, I carried the guilt of leaving, of not being here when he needed me. Now I know the truth, and I can live with it. Henry visits Old Mill Creek every month, leaving wildflowers on the bank where his brother died. He has become an unofficial guardian of Jacob's memory, sharing stories with journalists and researchers who continue to study the case. His testimony helped convict 3 members of the cattle rustling network, who were still alive and prosecutable. Jacob died doing what he thought was right, Henry says, his voice steady with conviction. He saw injustice and couldn't let it stand. That's the legacy I want people to remember. The Danner family farm was eventually sold to the state and converted into a wildlife management area. The old farmhouse was demolished, but the barn still stands. Its weathered wood, serving as a roosting place for barn owls and a reminder of the family that once called this place home. A historical marker, erected in 2007, tells the story of Jacob's disappearance and the investigation that followed. Jacob Earl Danner, 1936 to 1979. Farmer, neighbor, truth-teller. His courage in confronting corruption cost him his life, but ultimately brought justice to his community. The marker faces east, toward the sunrise Jacob would have watched from his kitchen window each morning. Dolores Halbrook struggled with her husband's legacy until her death in 2012. She spent her final years working with victim advocacy groups, using her experience to help other families cope with the aftermath of violent crime. The scholarship fund she established in Jacob's name has helped 37 young people attend college, including 3 who went on to careers in law enforcement. Mrs. Halbrook never got over what Royce had done, recalls Pastor Michael Torres, who counseled her through her final years. But she found peace in trying to help others. She said if she couldn't change the past, at least she could try to influence the future. The investigation techniques developed during the Danner case have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across rural America. Sheriff Williams pioneered the use of community archaeology projects, training volunteers to assist in cold case excavation. The success at Old Mill Creek led to similar discoveries in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Kansas. Rural communities have long memories, Williams explains. People know things, see things, remember things that seem unimportant at the time. Our job is to create an environment where they feel safe sharing those memories. The Danner case also highlighted the vulnerability of agricultural communities to organized crime. New federal task forces focus specifically on livestock theft, using modern technology to track cattle movements and identify suspicious patterns. The informal trust that allowed operations like Royce's to flourish has been replaced by electronic monitoring and detailed documentation. We've learned that tradition and technology can work together, explains Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who studies rural crime patterns at Texas A&M University. You don't have to abandon the community values that make rural life special, but you do need to protect yourself against those who would exploit that trust. Carlos Mendoza, the ranch hand, whose testimony finally solved the case, became a citizen advocate for immigrant rights. His experience hiding in fear for 26 years highlighted the importance of creating safe channels for undocumented witnesses to report crimes. Several states have since passed laws protecting immigrant witnesses from deportation when they cooperate with law enforcement. Carlos showed incredible courage in coming forward, notes immigration attorney Maria Santos. His story demonstrates that justice often depends on the participation of society's most vulnerable members. We have to create systems that protect and encourage their involvement. The technological advances of the 21st century have revolutionized cold case investigation. DNA analysis, cell phone tracking, and digital forensics provide tools that weren't available to the investigators who first searched for Jacob Danner. But the case also demonstrated that the most important breakthroughs often come from human courage, the willingness of witnesses to finally tell their stories. All the technology in the world can't replace human conscience, reflects retired Deputy Walter Riggin, now 87, and spending his days in a nursing home in Sweetwater. Someone always knows something. The challenge is creating the circumstances where they're willing to share it. The case files from the Danner investigation are now stored at the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit in Austin, where they serve as a training resource for new investigators. The methodical documentation, the patient re-interviewing of witnesses, and the integration of new evidence into old theories provide a template for approaching unsolved cases. The Danner case teaches us that persistence pays off, says Sergeant Lisa Chang, who heads the cold case unit. 26 years is a long time, but justice doesn't have an expiration date. Families deserve answers, communities deserve closure, and victims deserve to be remembered. The windmill on Jacob's former property still turns in the Texas breeze, its metal blades catching the sunlight, as they have for over 50 years. Children from town sometimes ride their bicycles out to the wildlife area, exploring the creek beds and open fields that their grandparents once farmed. They know the story of Jacob Danner, passed down through family conversations and school reports. The kids ask a lot of questions, says wildlife manager Robert Kim, who oversees the former Dana property. They want to know why someone would steal cattle, why Jacob didn't just call the police, why it took so long to find the truth. It's a good opportunity to talk about courage and consequences. The annual Marston County Fair now includes a memorial tent dedicated to missing persons and cold cases. Families from across the region display photographs and information about their loved ones, hoping that someone in the crowd might have the piece of information that could break their case. The tent is sponsored by the Jacob Dana Memorial Fund and staffed by volunteers who understand the pain of unanswered questions. Jacob's story gives people hope, explains Fair Coordinator Nancy Mitchell. If his case could be solved after 26 years, maybe their cases can be solved too. Maybe their loved ones can finally come home. The Cotton Ridge Diner closes at sunset now, its neon sign flickering against the purple sky as another day ends in Marston County. The parking lot is quieter than it was in Jacob's time, as interstate highways have drawn traffic away from the small-town cafes that once anchored rural communities. But the stories remain, passed from generation to generation, like family heirlooms. Linda Chen locks the diner door and walks to her car, pausing to look back at the memorial wall visible through the window. Jacob's rodeo photograph watches over the empty dining room, a permanent reminder that some mysteries have endings, even if those endings come decades after the questions were first asked. The Texas prairie stretches endlessly in all directions, holding secrets beneath its surface and stories its wind. Somewhere in that vastness, Jacob Earl Dana finally rests, his truth told, his justice served, his memory preserved in the community that never stopped caring about what happened to one of their own. In Marston, time didn't heal everything, but it did reveal everything. And sometimes, that's enough.